Okay, we got our feet wet in the book of Numbers last week, but moving through a large section of the book this week. And so let's talk some about the book of Numbers as a whole and what's going on and how best to understand a lot of what's going on in the book. Let's just start with the title. Numbers refers to what we saw last week, which is the counting of the people, the census taken of the people of Israel as they are leaving Mount Sinai and headed towards the Promised Land. But once you read the entire book of Numbers, we'll see that there's actually two censuses. Censi, I don't know if that's the right word, but there are two censuses, two countings of the people in the book of Numbers. There's one in chapter 1, which we've already read, and then there's one in chapter 26, which we will actually get to next week. And so we think, well, why are there two? That seems a little bit repetitive. And the answer to that comes in the middle of the book in chapters 13 and 14, which is maybe the most important story in the book of Numbers, or at least a central story in the book of Numbers, which is the incident at Kadesh Barnea, where the people are told to choose one man from each tribe to go and spy out the land, the promised land of Canaan. And they go in, and the report that they bring back is essentially, other than Joshua and Caleb, that we can't take the land. It's too hard. The cities are too big and strong. The people are too big. And so the people complain before the Lord and say, why have you brought us here just to be killed by these people in the land? We can't take it. Let's even just go back to Egypt. And the consequence of that is that God tells them, okay, you don't want to enter the land, you won't. And so because of their faithlessness in that instance, and probably the culmination of a lot of other things that we see in the book of Numbers, for instance, but because of their faithlessness, that generation, everybody 20 years or older, is going to die in the wilderness, and they're going to wander for 40 years. And it is the next generation, it is their children who will enter into the promised land. And so that's why there are two countings of the people. The first census in chapter 1 is the previous generation, the Sinai generation. And the second census in chapter 26 is the new generation. And so that kind of divides the book nicely into two parts. And the first part, the story of the old generation, is really a repetition of what we see in that story we just referenced, which is a rebellion against God, doubting of his faithfulness, and turning against him, and then the death that results from that. And so that's a lot of what we see in this week's reading. We got to finish up the introductory chapters where the people are preparing themselves to go on this journey toward the promised land. But then as soon as they set out, we see in chapter 11, they're complaining about food, missing the garlics and the leeks and the onions and the cucumbers from Egypt. And so God sends them meat, more meat than they can handle. But they complain about their food. In chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, the siblings of Moses, complain about his authority, and are rebuked for that. We talked about 13 and 14 and the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea and refusing to enter into the promised land. In chapters 16 and 17, Korah, one of the Levites and others that he's kind of rallied together, again go after Moses' authority and say, who do you think you are? God can speak through us too, or we can be leaders too. And they are swallowed up by the earth because of their rebellion. And then maybe most surprisingly, we come to chapter 20, where at the beginning of the chapter, Miriam dies. At the end of the chapter, Aaron dies and leaves his priesthood to the next generation. And in the bulk of the chapter, we have not only another complaining story of the people wanting water in the wilderness, But we have Moses himself rebelling against God to some degree, claiming glory for himself, disobeying the command to speak to the rock, striking it instead, but probably most importantly, saying in that moment, shall we bring water from this rock for you rebels? And so Moses's act of pride and of disobedience in that moment actually results in even him not being able to enter into the promised land. And so he's told that he will see it, but he will not enter it. And so that's what we have in this part of the book of Numbers. With the previous generation, we have over and over again a rebellion, a faithlessness, a complaining, and because of that, provoking God's wrath and receiving the punishment of that, which is death. And we see that over and over again. But a couple of things we want to say about that. One is that in all of these instances, we still see to some degree God's mercy, whether that's Moses standing up before God and saying, don't destroy these people altogether. Remember your covenant promises to Abraham and spare these people. And we see God sparing them. Or whether it's the story in chapter 21 of the serpents that are biting the people of Israel in the camp. And again, Moses intercedes and a bronze serpent is set up. And if they look to the bronze serpent, they will be healed. A foreshadowing, Jesus will comment on that in the Gospel of John about how he will be lifted up, and all who look to him, lifted up on the cross, will be healed. And so God's mercy continues even throughout this section of rebellion and death. So be looking for that. And the other thing we want to notice is that remember that all of these stories are being written down and recorded, not for that old generation necessarily, that previous generation, but these stories are being recorded for the new generation, for their benefit, for their instruction, for their warning, we might say, that they would learn from the previous generation. But that also helps us, I think, make some sense of some of the odd entries into this section of the book of Numbers. And so we have, after the story of Kadesh Barnea in 13 and 14, a chapter on the sin offering, on guilt offerings. In chapter 15, it's like all of a sudden we're whiplashed back into the book of Leviticus and the description of the offerings and the purpose of the offerings. But I think it's fair to think that instruction is included after having just told the story of the people's failure and the punishment. There is instruction about the new generation and how they are to go about atoning for their sins and for their guilt. And something similar, I think, later on in chapters 18 and 19, after the story of Korah's rebellion, there is a section about the Levites. Remember, Korah and his followers, they were Levites, and they had stepped out of their bounds of authority. So there's a section after that in 18 and 19 about the Levites and their role and their what their purpose is and how they serve and give up quite a bit, actually. They don't receive some of the things that the other tribes receive because they have this special purpose of protecting and serving in the tabernacle. So be looking for that as we see the overwhelming theme of rebellion and death. Notice God's mercy throughout this section, and pay attention to how these stories and the other passages that are included interspersed are for the instruction of the new generation. And that leads us then to what will be the last day of this week's reading, which is the story of Balaam and Balak. And we see all of this, I think, intertwined in this story. Balak is the king of Moab, and he is seeing the Israelites approaching, seeing them defeat great kings like Sihon and Og, which those stories are included here. And so he wants to do something about it. And so he hires Balaam to curse the Israelites, but of course Balaam can't do that. He himself learns some lessons through the talking donkey and the angel of the Lord. But Balaam 3 times is told to curse Israel, but can only bless them. And that story shows us God's protection of the people, unbeknownst to them. While they are, just going about their business, God is working through Balaam to bring a blessing on them, and even a messianic blessing. That the final time that Balaam speaks, he says that a star will come from what's the language here? A star will come out of Jacob, and a scepter will arise out of Israel. And so God, through Balaam, in the midst of the people's weakness and rebellion and their and the wrath that's coming upon them in the wilderness, God is recommitting himself. He's doubling down. He's giving this assurance that he is faithful to Israel, and from them will come this star, this scepter, that will bring this blessing that he promised to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. And so we see all of that there. And yet, in the very next chapter, in chapter 25, the Moabites find a way to bring down Israel, and it's not through cursing, it is through seduction. And the Israelites are seduced into idol worship and fornication with the Moabite women, and again, more death because of that. That leads up. But we have Phinehas in that chapter standing up and taking a stand and kind of showing himself to be the priest of the next generation, as the old generation continues to die in their rebellion. And that then gets us to chapter 26 and the second census, which will kick off next week's reading. But for now, that is the first big section of the book of Numbers, and maybe big picture, how to make sense of a lot of what's going on.